All right, picture a sailor from the age of sail. What do you see? A rugged hero wrestling the ship's wheel against a raging storm, wind in his hair, salt on his lips. And what's for dinner? You're probably imagining him pulling a glistening tuna from the turquoise water, roasting it over a fire, and feasting on the ocean's bounty, right? Yeah, no, that's a lovely thought, but it's mostly a fantasy. You think that a life on the ocean meant a diet of fresh, delicious fish every day. But the truth is, for sailors on long voyages, fish was an unreliable, occasional treat. Their actual diet was something that would make a modern-day survivalist say, "You know what, I think I'll just starve." The food they relied on for months, even years at sea, was less about taste and more about one simple, brutal quality: being nearly impossible to kill. We're talking about food so durable you could probably build a house with it. And today, we're diving headfirst into that barrel of, well, you'll see. So why was this so critical? Why not just pack some extra bread and cheese and hope for the best? Because on a ship in the middle of the ocean, your greatest enemy isn't a pirate, a kraken, or even a hurricane. Your true enemy is the calendar. Every single day, time is working against you. It's a relentless force turning your food into a slimy, moldy, bug-infested science experiment. Now imagine you have to pack a lunchbox for 200 people. Now imagine that lunchbox has to stay edible for 3 years. There's no fridge, no freezer, no Tupperware. There's just a damp, dark, rat-infested wooden box floating on the water. The air is thick with salt and humidity, the perfect breeding ground for mold and bacteria. Your water goes slimy in weeks, your bread turns green, your meat, well, it starts to move on its own. This wasn't just about avoiding a bad meal, this was about survival. A poorly fed crew was a weak crew, and a weak crew couldn't fight, they couldn't sail, and they got sick. The ultimate killer wasn't starvation itself, it was deficiency diseases, chief among them the terrifying ghost of the high seas, scurvy. Scurvy would rot you from the inside out. It could wipe out more than half a crew on a single long voyage. In the 18th century, it killed more British sailors than all enemy action combined. So finding food that could last wasn't just a matter of convenience, it was the single most important technological challenge of the era. They had to defeat time itself. And their first attempts were, let's just say, a bit of a disaster. Before they found what worked, sailors and their captains tried a few things that sound logical on paper, but were utterly absurd in practice. Their first big idea? The floating farmyard. "I know," some captain probably said, "let's bring the food with us while it's still alive." So they loaded ships with chickens for eggs, goats for milk, and pigs for eventual bacon. It sounds like a charming, self-sustaining little ark, right? Wrong. It was a chaotic, seasick barnyard from hell. The animals took up precious space. They ate the crew's rations and drank their water. The goats would get seasick and stop giving milk. The chickens would be too stressed to lay eggs. And the smell? Imagine 100 unwashed sailors plus a bunch of terrified farm animals in a confined space. It wasn't just unappetizing, it was a biological weapon. Then there were the early failed attempts at food preservation. They knew salting and drying worked, a little, but they hadn't perfected it. They'd pack barrels of beef that was just a little too damp, or fish that wasn't salted quite enough. A few months into the voyage, a sailor would open a barrel and be hit with a smell so foul it could peel paint. They had created concentrated, weaponized rot. It quickly became clear that fresh was a fantasy, and good enough could kill you. They needed food that wasn't just preserved. They needed food that was practically mummified. They needed something indestructible. So what did this indestructible menu look like? Welcome to the holy trinity of naval cuisine. First up, the foundation of every sailor's diet, ship's biscuit. also known as hardtack. How did it work? The recipe was brilliantly simple. Flour, water, and a little salt. That's it. No yeast, no oil, no flavor. It was baked 4, sometimes 5 times, until every last molecule of moisture was gone. This created a biscuit so dense and so dry that mold and bacteria couldn't get a foothold. It was, for all intents and purposes, eternal. Archaeologists have found 150-year-old hardtack that is still technically edible. But here's the amazing detail. While it was immortal, it wasn't impenetrable. It was the favorite food of the ship's weevils. Sailors would find their biscuits riddled with these little beetles and their larvae, but they couldn't afford to throw them away, so they developed a technique. Before eating, a sailor would tap his biscuit firmly on the table. The theory was the healthy, living weevils would fall out, while the dead or sick ones would remain inside. Some sailors joked that it was better to eat the biscuits in the dark so you didn't have to see what you were chewing. They called the weevils bargemen, a protein bonus to their carb-heavy brick. To eat it, you couldn't just bite in, you'd break your teeth. They had to soak it in water, beer, or soup for an hour just to make it soft enough to chew. Hardtack is basically the Nokia phone of food. You can drop it, get it wet, ignore it for a century, and it'll still work. Next on the menu, the main course, salt pork or salt beef. This was their solution for protein. The process was called corning. Huge cuts of beef or pork were packed into barrels with mountains of salt. The salt would draw out all the water through osmosis, creating an environment where bacteria couldn't survive. How did it work? A little too well. The process didn't just preserve the meat, it transformed it. The meat became incredibly hard, dense, and shrunken. It was so tough that sailors would carve it into trinkets, like chess pieces or buttons, that would last for the whole voyage. The astonishing detail? The meat was often so old by the time they ate it that it had its own slang. They called it salt horse or mahogany. It had to be soaked in water for a full day just to draw out some of the overwhelming salt and make it vaguely chewable. Even then, it was stringy, tough, and tasted more like salt than anything else. Think of beef jerky. Now, imagine that beef jerky went to prison for 20 years, got into a lot of fights, and came out even tougher and saltier. That's salt horse. To go with your rock-hard biscuit and salty meat brick, you needed side dishes. The star player here was peas, or dried peas. They were light, they were cheap, and they lasted forever. The ship's cook would boil them for hours into a thick, bland porridge called peas pottage. It was the glue that held the meal together. It was served so often that it inspired the nursery rhyme, peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot, 9 days old. That wasn't a joke, it was a literal description of their diet. It was the bland, reliable background music to their entire voyage. And finally, what do you wash all this down with? Water? Absolutely not. Water stored in wooden casks for months would grow algae and turn into a slimy, foul-tasting sludge. The answer was alcohol. Initially, they used beer, but it spoiled too quickly, so they turned to the miracle liquid of the Caribbean, rum. It was stable, potent, and a fantastic morale booster. But sailors drinking straight rum all day was a recipe for disaster. So, in 1740, British Admiral Edward Vernon, whose nickname was Old Grog because of his grogram cloak, ordered that the sailors' daily rum ration be mixed with water. The sailors hated it, so they named the watered-down drink Grog after the admiral they blamed. It was their after-work beer, their morning coffee, and their social lubricant, all in one cup. A tot of grog made a dinner of weevils and salt horse just a little more bearable. Now, this diet was great at keeping sailors from starving, but it was still missing something vital, which led to the horrors of scurvy. And the story of how they solved that is a perfect example of leadership and human psychology, starring the legendary captain James Cook. On his long voyages across the Pacific in the 1770s, Cook was obsessed with the health of his crew. He had a theory that scurvy could be beaten. One of his secret weapons was sauerkraut, fermented cabbage. He loaded 60 barrels of it on his ship. But there was a problem. 18th century British sailors were stubborn. They didn't like new, foreign-sounding food. You can't just tell a tough, suspicious sailor, "Here, eat this sour German cabbage. It's good for you." They would have thrown it overboard.
So Cook used a brilliant psychological trick. He didn't force anyone to eat it. Instead, he ordered that sauerkraut be served only to the officers' table, every single day, right in front of the crew. For a week, the regular sailors watched the officers eat this special food. They started whispering, "What is that stuff? If the captain and the officers are eating it, it must be a delicacy. They're keeping the good stuff for themselves." Soon enough, a delegation of sailors went to Cook and formally requested that they be allowed to have some sauerkraut too. Cook slyly agreed, as if he were granting them a huge privilege. And just like that, the entire crew was eating sauerkraut, and, as a result, Cook famously lost very few men to scurvy. He didn't use force, he used FOMO, fear of missing out. And of course, there's the story behind the nickname limeys. By the late 18th century, the British Royal Navy finally made it official policy to issue citrus juice, first lemons, then cheaper limes from their Caribbean colonies, to sailors to prevent scurvy. This gave them a massive strategic advantage. Their crews could stay at sea for longer, remaining healthier than their French or Spanish rivals. American sailors noticed this and started calling the British sailors limeys, a name that stuck for centuries. So when we look back at the age of sail, at the great explorers and epic naval battles, it's easy to get caught up in the romance of it all. But the reality is, the entire engine of global exploration and empire building rested on a foundation of the most boring, brutal, and indestructible food imaginable. These barrels of salt pork and sacks of hardtack weren't just dinner. They were a technology. They were the fuel that powered voyages of discovery and conquest. They were, in their own way, more valuable to an empire than cannons or gold. Without a solution to the simple, deadly problem of the lunchbox, modern history would look completely different. It was a world where weevils were a source of protein, where bread could break your teeth, and where meat was used for arts and crafts. So the next time you open your fridge and complain that there's nothing to eat, just remember the sailors of old and be thankful that your biggest dietary challenge isn't figuring out how to make a 50-year-old biscuit edible. It turns out the most incredible voyages in human history were powered by the most humble and surprisingly clever food on Earth. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this dive into naval history, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what other historical deep dives you'd like to see. See you next time.